Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W. As we conclude our discussion in this lecture today about slavery in the colonial era, I want to conclude by talking about the thing that was feared more than any other by white slave owners, particularly in the South, and that was slave rebellion. Slave owners could not imagine that slaves would want to rebel and only to achieve freedom and leave. They were convinced that if slaves had this measure of freedom, they would turn around and attack and kill whites. Now we're going to talk about that phenomenon much more in later lectures about slavery in the antebellum period. But in this one we're going to talk about slave rebellions in the colonial era. Now, I want to focus on two slave rebellions in particular to give you some sense of what was meant by this idea of a slave rebellion. But I just want to point out in this chart, during the colonial period, the years mentioned on this map, 1676 to 1859, there were several dozen slave rebellions up and down the colonies, and I would point out that quite a few of them are in the north, and in fact the first one that I want to talk about today occurred in New York City in 1712. So we're going to start with that one in New York in 1712. The dreaded slave rebellion. So in this particular episode, a group of about 24 slaves, according to a prearranged plan, burned several buildings in New York City and murdered 9 white men, wounding about the same number. Now we're not entirely certain what they hoped to achieve, but apparently they hoped to burn the city to the ground and escape into the wilderness. In reality, though, the fires were put out and the slaves were caught and rounded up. And then this was followed by a trial that was carried out with great enthusiasm by the white slave owners and others who wanted to see the slaves punished. And in fact, the punishment that was put upon these slaves was intended to send a message to any other slaves who might have a thought in the future of rebelling. So these were the punishments of the slaves who were captured. 13 were hanged. 3 were burned to death. 1 was left to die in chains without food. 1 was broken on a wheel, and 1 was roasted over a slow fire for 8 to 10 hours. So all of these horrific punishments were intended to intimidate and strike the fear into slaves who might have intentions of rebelling in the future. The other example that I want to talk about is the Stono Rebellion in South Carolina in 1739. And earlier in the lecture, I talked about South Carolina as kind of walking this tightrope between repressing slave freedoms and allowing them to have some freedom because it made them actually more effective workers. And by 1739, South Carolina, in walking this tightrope, was coming down increasingly on the side of harsher restrictions and limiting freedoms. And so what was beginning to happen is you were starting to see more and more slave runaways and acts of resistance as we approach what turned out to be the Stono Rebellion in 1739. And in fact, leading up to that rebellion, office holders in Charlestown were already discussing even harsher measures of restricting the slaves. So by February 1739, there were rumors of a potential slave uprising that were circulating throughout the colony, causing great fear and anxiety among white slaveholders. Recall that we are, in this region, we are relatively close to what at that time was Spanish Florida. And that was known to be a safe harbor for runaway slaves. In fact, there were a number of slaves that had already run away and achieved safety in Florida. And so that's actually what the slaves involved in this rebellion intended to do. So just as an example, kind of leading up to the Stono Rebellion itself, in April, 4 slaves who were all skilled horsemen escaped the colony of South Carolina and fled to St. Augustine. 1 was killed by Indians, another was captured. The other 2 actually reached St. Augustine and were freed. Now, the one who was captured, just like we saw in New York, was hung. and then his body was left hanging in chains as a warning to other slaves. All right, so this is all coming to a head by September. And in September, 3 different factors actually hastened what became this revolt. The first was an outbreak of yellow fever, which weakened and kind of dazed the white population. They were distracted by this disease. A second was the fact that a council passed a law announcing that all white men had to carry firearms to church. This was intended to actually lessen the chance of an uprising, but the rebellion occurred the week before this law was to go into effect. And then the third was that war was declared between the Spanish and English, and the slaves likely seized on this instance of confusion to launch their rebellion. So the rebellion itself began on September 9th, 1739, at a small river called the Stono River near Charleston. About 20 slaves assembled, ransacked an arms store, and killed its owner. And from there, the band marched generally southward, killing plantation owners and their families and recruiting slaves along the way. They were carrying drums and chanting liberty as they marched. The slaves stopped after marching about 10 miles and made camp for the night. At that point, they numbered about 60 and hoped that by morning they would be joined by hundreds more. In fact, though, their stopping allowed the white community a chance to regroup and arm. By morning, a band of local whites, perhaps 100 strong, surrounded the encampment and murdered those who tried to return to their plantations. Over the course of the day, several small bands managed to escape. Another one reformed and continued south, and at that point the whites went on a manhunt in the area, killing many individual slaves and ultimately capturing and destroying the larger group, which had made their way another 30 miles or so closer to Florida. So this rebellion, like the one in New York and like essentially all the rest, was put down violently. So the next several years were very tense around Charleston. In 1740, another group of slaves rebelled, but they were easily captured and put down as well. And there were many other instances of resistance, much like I talked about in the previous lecture. So what were the results of the Stono Rebellion? Well, in the immediate aftermath, South Carolina slaveholders realized the incentive in trying to ease restrictions somewhat on slaves so that they would have less incentive to run away. So there were laws passed against excessively cruel treatment of slaves. They also began to open a small number of Negro schools, this is what they were called at the time, to try to convert more slaves to Christianity. And again, this was actually a measure of control, though it was not overt or violent. They also passed a new Negro Act, a series of laws which tightened controls upon slaves, restricting their freedom of movement, providing more surveillance by masters, and tighter penalties against masters who couldn't control their slaves. There is also for a time an effort to import more white workers, which we talked about this with Bacon's Rebellion about a century earlier, but this was a short-lived effort to go back to relying more on white indentured servants. So really none of these efforts was entirely successful. Thoughts of kind of inviting slaves to have more freedom were pretty quickly evaporated in the next few years, and the final outcome was only further to increase white repression and decrease attempts at black autonomy and freedom. And thus what we're going to see is the institution of slavery, which was horrific enough in the colonial era, getting only more and more repressive as we start to move into what we will describe as the antebellum era, approaching the years of the Civil War. So, in our remaining couple of lectures for this chapter, we're going to return to a discussion of broader colonial relations and leading us toward what eventually becomes the outbreak of the Revolutionary War.